and welcome to the third episode of the Public Education Now podcast, a student initiative unpacking the effects of privatization and how we can create more just, equitable, and sustainable futures. In our previous episode, we were joined by Lucas Fellicetti, an associate researcher at the National Institute of Science and Technology for Teaching Work and Education Policy, to discuss his research on how private actors, specifically think tanks, approach the right to education in Brazil and the implications of this for national education policy. Additionally, as part of his doctoral research, Lucas utilized the Abidjan Principles as both a methodological and an analytical tool to explore and understand the impacts of think tanks on the right to education. Picking up on this and over to Lucas. Lucas, my first question for you is that why did you choose to use the Abidjan Principles in your work?
So, great question. The Abidjan Principles came in my research because I was trying to understand Livres' actions and their impact on the right to education through a global lens.
Right.
Considering that they are connected to this global network idea of private and non-state actors, institutions influencing the right to education, the education policies around the globe. So if I so since I am understanding them through that lens, it could be hard for me to analyze their political doing over the right to education in a national way, through the national legislation, through the national literature. Of course, I could do that, but I wanted to link this with the global perspective of the international human rights law. And going through that, the Abidjan principles become a really important tool for me because the Abidjan principles do not promote any new right. It's not like um, a trait or a covenant or similar, but it's like a, some guiding principles, a document that guide people that want to understand how the right to education global sphere works, and goes to the Abidjan principles to see how this right is perceived by international law, how it is conceived, how it is understood. And it really helped me in the way that how should I focus my perception about the right to education. And it was really important, and I think it's a really great instrument.
And are there any limitations of the Abidjan Principles that you came across during your research?
It's
Yeah.
not enough for my topic and for other reasons, but I think specifically for 2 points here that we should approach. The first one is that it is mainly focused on how states should work to promote the right to education in a context full of private actors trying to influence, to promote their own agendas in the educational systems. But the Abidjan principles focus mainly in structural actors and actors that are really investing in education. So big companies, uh, actors they are trying to promote really status quo privatization of the education, like blind schools, vouchers, charter schools. And this actually doesn't fit the idea of the human right to education, considering think tanks that they actually do not buy anything. They
Yeah.
don't create schools, they don't teach, they don't create textbooks for people to teach in schools. They try to influence the policy making process. They're privatizing the policy, the decision making for education policies. So the Abidjan principles don't approach that idea. There's the, I think, if I recall, the guiding principle 59 that says that the states should regulate the doing of non-structural actors, but it says more like eh, actors they are promoting school maintenance, the like food for students and other supplies that complement the schooling process, but not focusing on actors they are trying to influence the policy making. So this is a point that the Abidjan principles are missing, but it's not only the Abidjan principles, because the Abidjan principles are trying to condense to explain what the human rights law, international human rights law, are saying about the right to education. So that's a failure of the human rights law, not necessarily a failure of the right of the Abidjan principles.
Hmm. Right. So kind of picking up on what you were talking about in terms of this friction, or this rather failure of human rights law in creating these protections that can actually help us push back against these forces that are hindering the right to education. Can you speak a bit more about that, perhaps?
Of course. So uh, the right to education through the international human rights law don't approach the idea of private institutions trying to influence the policymaking process overall. So this makes some difficulties for the Abidjan principles to approach that in a way to guide states, social movements, or even companies and private actors to promote the right to education in a good manner, defending these ideas, because there's no basis for that in the international human rights law. Of course, the Abidjan principles have other issues, especially considering the how institutions, private institutions, promote education as instructional actors, but focusing specifically in this topic of how think tanks, knowledge brokers, and other institutions that influence the right to education, the decisions regarding education policy. The international human rights law it fails to address these topics, and it's important to notice that the human rights law uh, is decided by states. You always have been decided by states. So states don't really consider this as a problem.
Yes, the Abidjan principles are focused on other issues, as you've said, principally on the role of private actors in the delivery of education. And your explanation of how the influence of private actors in education policy making is overlooked in international human rights law has made me think. How are the roles of these actors perceived more generally? Perhaps you could give us an example from Brazil.
Such as we are talking about Livres. Livres' perspective on the right to education is perceived as a really well structured idea of the right to education. It is, in some points, it is, although it fails to address many different aspects of it.
Yes, it was really great to hear about that in the previous episode of the podcast.
And if you consider that not only leaders, but many different actors, private actors, third sector actors, philanthropies, uh, uh, bank foundations, and other institutions are within the Brazilian state working, deciding for education policies. And the Brazilian state cannot implement public policies without these actors. It's hard to conceive that they are seen as problematic. So the idea that is the main point is that people, the state, the policymakers, the decision makers don't perceive these points as harmful for the right to education, don't perceive this uh, private ideas as problematic to understand, to conceive the right to education, just as different perspectives on
Mhm.
education. Usually it's not the way that things really works for people, for students, for teachers, and they have gained leverage and power over influencing educational policy overall, and they are making the rules. So they are promoting their education policy and they're creating the rules. They are deciding what is the right to education or not. So
Yeah, it's starting to sound like these think tanks, or rather knowledge workers, have huge power, but it's not really recognized generally.
this is the point that the situation, the problem is within how the human rights law were made, have been made, and how they're being implemented, by whom they're being implemented. And it's not only in this manner, not only to make private institutions such as think tanks accountable for the actions within the international human rights law for indulging privatization of education policies and whatever uh, problems that it addresses or it comes up with for the people. But in the same time, these institutions are within the state. So it's not necessarily pointing out to Libris, oh, you have done wrong, or any other philanthropies or other institutions, but it's for us to understand that these institutions are making the rules because they are not only private institutions, they are the state. So this is kind of really complicated.
Yeah, yeah,
I have no answer how to approach that.
yeah.
We have to discuss. This has to be a, a, a public and collective fight, a collective discussion. But it's harder than we think it is. It's
Yeah.
tougher. The situation is more problematic than we think it is when we start digging into these situations. So I think that that's the point.
Yeah, and that sounds really messy. It's like a blurring together of the state with private interests through these think tanks. And as you say, it seems essential that more people are aware and are discussing this phenomena.
And to end it, hopefully on a more positive note, what would you say is after doing this research and delving into these issues, what do you think is one key takeaway that you have from all of this in terms of perhaps improving education as a whole globally and also for creating more just and equitable futures for our future generations? How do you think you would approach that?
Well, I usually talk about bad things, about bad actors and how they approach education. Um, but I think the main takeaway is to understand, like
Yeah.
not necessarily taking understand is taking action, but uh, I think for us to take any action towards a more just, more equitable, and uh, for more an education based on the human right idea of human dignity, we should understand how things are being done,
Right.
how private actors, state actors, uh, civil, the civil society is acting on education. So that's the point of understanding, to creating research of how these actors, how these networks are being understood. So that's the importance of understanding, researching about how different actors are approaching education, how they're influencing education. That's why it's important not only to research how we can do different, but how are these private actors really influencing education? Even if it's an international organization, big company, or actors that are not that much research in the field, such as think tanks, knowledge brokers, institutions that train political leaders. There are no research on that, so we have to understand they are training new uh, uh, government officials to promote their own agenda in the states, in the governments. So we have to understand them for us to make actions with this understanding.
What a great note to end on. And I agree that the journey to creating more just, equitable education systems and strengthening the right to education for all really starts with understanding our current context.
Thank you so much for joining us, Lucas. It was so great hearing about your research, and we look forward to seeing more of it.
Views expressed during the podcast are those of the speakers alone. The inclusion of these views does not represent an endorsement by the Public Education Now team or PERC.